All right, welcome to the afternoon session of our stereo technology. Next, we'll be having our next speaker is Chris Kenny, who is the compositing supervisor at Rhythm and Use, and he's going to tell us about why Life of Pi can only be made in 3D.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to Giving Dimension to Life of Pi. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be getting into. Some introductions, who I am, who RNH is, RNH's stereo history, why stereo for this movie, our stereo development and our stereo pipeline, how we got it done, the affected departments, and then a particular focus on compositing. And I'll finish up with some Q&A. So I was a sequence supervisor on Life of Pi for Rhythm and Hughes. I've been at Rhythm and Hughes for about 6 years, and about half of that I've been a supervisor. A sequence supervisor is kind of unique to Rhythm and Hughes, but it's much like a CG supervisor at other studios. It involves direct supervision of lighting and compositing. I supervised about 9 key sequences in Life of Pi, and that was about 120 shots. Sequence supervisors also kind of get to drive the look of the sequence and keep their finger on the pulse of the other departments and drive the logistics of the sequence by meeting with other departments. Here are some of the features I've worked on. And Rhythm and Hughes is an Academy Award-winning computer animation VFX studio. They were founded in 1987, so just over 26 years now. They focus on the high end of the VFX and animation market and have delivered over 140 Hollywood feature films, hundreds of TV commercials, and actually a number of theme park rides, which I'll be talking about today. I do have to acknowledge for a moment that Rhythm and Hughes, while it was over 1,300 employees just recently, and it was 1,000 when I wrote this slide, it is now much, much smaller because they've been hurt, just like some other studios, by some of the forces in the industry, and they were forced to downscale. Some extremely talented, very experienced folks, some very good friends of mine, had to be laid off, and I didn't want to gloss over that. So Rhythm and Hughes has actually been working on stereo for quite a while. It started in 1997 with a theme park ride, Race for Atlantis. That was a 3D IMAX feature for Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Then it was T-Rex, Back to the Cretaceous, which is a edutainment film, also in IMAX. Then It's Tough to Be a Bug, which was a 4D ride at Disneyland based on Pixar's A Bug's Life. And 4D means it involves physical special effects, so wind and water and the seats rock. And that's still at Disneyland there. And then there was a break for a while, and we moved into stereoscopic features, both native stereo, Yogi Bear in 2010 and Life of Pi in 2012. Yogi Bear was actually our first major native stereoscopic feature, and so some of the images I'll show you are Yogi Bear, although I tried to keep it just to Life of Pi. So I wanted to show you a bit of what Race for Atlantis looked like. Keep in mind this was 1997. So notice the weird perspective here. That was because it was projected on an IMAX dome. The ride chamber housed 82-foot diameter IMAX dome screen and 4 27-passenger motion simulator bases, accommodating up to 1,000 riders per hour. This was actually very sophisticated for its time. I also wanted to touch on it because its new home is a few hundred kilometers north of here at a theme park in the Rhineland called Phantasialand. I also wanted to touch on it because the man who directed it is the man who recently brought Rhythm and Hughes out of bankruptcy, Arish Faizi, which is an interesting full circle. All right, so why this film? That was the first question everybody had for me when I told them I was working on Life of Pi, but it was in stereo. Ang Lee, he's a serious filmmaker, and he makes serious movies, and Life of Pi was a serious book, and 3D has a very real stigma still associated with it. Please, nobody take this out of context. This is the point I'm trying to make a point against. I think stereo can be used as an artistic tool. It's not just cheap thrill for cheap movies. It's not just profit motivated, and even in spite of examples like Avatar and Pixar's movies, I think stereo still has a long way to go to overcome that stigma. So Life of Pi had its 3D moments, like that, like this. But we generally tried to keep stuff away from the lens, except for when it mattered like that. So with a light touch, 3D moments get great reactions. And it's kind of what the audience expects when they go to a 3D movie, and it can make it more engaging. When it's misused, it's seen as a gimmick, and it can make movies less engaging because it makes you aware that you're watching a movie, and it can actually be physically painful. Ang Lee wanted to use stereo as a storytelling tool. He was actually really excited to experiment with it. He wanted to play with stereo to give the viewer a sense of scale, such as the wave's size and distance, and Pi and the tiger's shared space. He wanted to make that more real and more intimate. We found that 3D stereo added a sense of realism to things like the tiger. Since you're actually seeing two 2K images at the same time, obviously one on each eye, but that's twice as much information that's hitting your brain, and we felt like it really did add to the realism of the tiger in particular. And then it was great for POV shots. It made that feel very real. But finally, and most importantly, he wanted to use it as an emotional tool to convey a sense of fear, power, and solitude. And he did that by shooting these walls of water that, in stereo, feel very, very real and very threatening. Mirrored skies, so the sky mirrored into the water, made Pi feel like he was floating out there and alone. And then distant horizons, again, for the solitude. That was a big, big part of this movie.
Orange juice!
So a wall of water and the mirrored sky and the distant horizon. So enough of the 2D. Let's watch it all in stereo. Here's some of my favorite clips from Life of Pi in 3D.
My name is Pai Patel. I am on a lifeboat alone with the tiger.
So I know that was long, but I needed you all to see that if any of you hadn't before, because wasn't that better for having been in 3D? So where did this begin for us? We started with the Aslan test in August 2009. So if you're doing the math, that was 3 years from the time we started to the time we delivered. And a lot of that time was spent on R&D. And with that R&D period being so long, we could focus on getting stuff right in that period so that when the time came to the actual shots, we weren't worried about fixing stuff. We weren't worried about just getting it to work. We were able to focus on the performance. And it allowed us to build a very efficient, very natural 3D pipeline at Rhythm. So this is what we ended up delivering to Ang Lee as a final test. You have a 3D on screen left here and 2D on screen right, and that's how he preferred to look at it. And what he was trying to evaluate was, does a character look more or less real in 3D? And he decided that yes, it did, for kind of the reasons I talked about before, the more information hitting your eye and getting to share that space. For us, it was also a test to see, could we do it? And it also gave us a chance to play with things like how interocular and convergence affect the viewer both physically and emotionally. So we started at the very, very bottom, low level. I know this is dry. I mean, I'm showing you an image header, for God's sakes, but I wanted to show you that we really, since we have a proprietary pipeline, we knew there'd be some development involved in getting this to work. So we got to start at the very bottom and think about how we wanted it to work, not just how other people were doing it. And again, this was 2008 when we started, and there weren't a lot of examples. So our file sets were symmetrical. Channel names, we have L underscore and R underscore. This made it unambiguous and then easy for scripting. And then our QuickTimes, we wrote a proprietary version of QuickTimes encoder and playback system so that we had a dual track video, which meant it was backwards compatible with our whole hierarchical storage machine, and it meant we could do viewing options on the fly. So we could keep both tracks separately, and then anytime in the future down the road we wanted to view it in a different way with different kinds of glasses or different kinds of anaglyph or whatever, we could do that on the fly on the GPU with a fragment shader. We also had to figure out which viewing options we were going to use in the studio. We first tried shutter glasses, which is what you guys are using now. And again, in 2008, that was a while ago in technology world. The shutter glasses had great 3D back then still, but they were bulky and they were extremely expensive. They were nearly $200 a pair. And so that meant we couldn't have our entire huge studio using them. And it also meant we had to carry it around in a gun case. Anytime somebody wanted to view 3D, we had to call a guy to get him down there and gingerly open up the case and pass them out. So that wasn't going to work. Next, we have anaglyph as an option. Everybody knows anaglyph. This is great because the glasses are super cheap. So we were able to buy boxes of thousands of them, ship them all over the world to our other studios, and every artist has a monitor that can display anaglyph because it's just a lookup table. So this is great for depth, but obviously the color is horrible. So what we settled on was the polarized glasses, Realty glasses. That's great because the glasses are also cheap, like anaglyph, not as cheap, but very, very cheap. The display is a little bit more expensive, but what we did was give every supervisor at Rhythm & Hues a stereo monitor, and they could use anaglyph polarized glasses like this. And then our screening rooms, we equipped with a Z screen, and we're able to basically we had to flip the screen every time we wanted to view 3D to a silver screen. But that way, every artist could grab a pair of these cheap glasses when they came in and view 3D, just like we are now. But we also experimented with other options, like mirror mode. This is literally where you hold a mirror in between your eyes, and you kind of look across it like that. So one of your eyes looks to one image, and the other actually bounces off the mirror and hits another image, which is flipped in the hardware. So you're able to fuse it like that. And it actually gives you great 3D. It was the best option we had in the very beginning. If you used a first surface mirror, that's where the reflective part is on the outside of the glass, not the inside. But those are expensive, and this was really awkward, so we gave that up. And then there's wiggle vision. At least that's what we like to call it. And that's what I'm going to be using throughout this presentation to kind of give you a sense of the 3D. Now, this isn't real stereopsis. You're not getting a sense of the depth, kind of in your brain, but wiggling back and forth like this, once you get used to it, you can kind of evaluate the depth, evaluate any problems. So everything moving, from the left eye to the right eye towards screen right, that's positive parallax. That's behind the screen plane. Everything moving the opposite directions in front, and anything not moving is right on the convergence line. So it was helpful to evaluate stereo buzz in 3D. That's when there's retinal rivalry with actual 3D glasses. But then when you wanted to figure out what was causing that, when you just got that tingly sensation in your brain, like something's wrong, you'd use wiggle vision, and you'd be able to spot the differences. We also experimented with and then kept in mind the screen size. As the screen size gets bigger, the stereo effect changes. The apparent depth of an object changes, and dramatically. If you're working on a monitor like this, you can't make a call about what depth is comfortable or what depth is appropriate. So we kept all of our decision-making about stereo to a screen size like this. We were exploring every avenue to make this working with 2 images not twice as much work. So we overhauled our in-house compositor, which is called ICEY. We wanted it to be really natural, and we wanted old scripts to just work in the new pipeline. So we got deep roster support for every single node. So prior to that, if you tried to feed a deep image to some nodes, they just broke. But now every node in ICEY just works on deep file sets, which is how we stored our stereo. And that was important for existing workflows because we'd been using, ICEY's been in development for 25 years. So we have a lot of our pipeline built around using ICEY scripts. Most notably is our light comp, which takes all of our numerous render passes and kind of pares them down to still a large number of render passes, but a lot fewer. And that has 10,000 nodes. We didn't want to rewire that up. And so we ended up with an implementation that was really natural and worked really well. So well, in fact, that compositors could forget that they were working in stereo. You can see the viewing options here. We've got left, right side by side, top, bottom. That's mirror mode with the one flipped anaglyph. And then if you were on a stereo monitor, you'd get another option for polarized glasses, or if you had an active machine, active glasses. And so I'd have to remember, click on the R, because ICEY would open default by showing you just the left eye, and people would comp just in the left eye and forget that they were working in stereo, which is great, until they forgot that stuff needed to happen differently in the right eye sometimes. And then, of course, we had to increase the performance. So, again, this was a while ago, but even still, ICEY was a little behind by not having 64-bit capabilities or multi-threading or GPU capabilities. So we didn't need that for stereo, and we could have done it before stereo, but stereo kind of gave us a reason to overhaul it. We needed to figure out how stereo roto and paint worked. So again, try to design this to avoid a doubling of our work. So here's a video of a shape. You've got the left eye on the left or the right eye on the right. The shape's already been cloned, and then the compositor can nudge it manually to line up with the features. Once there, then you can move both points at the same time, viewing them interactively, or you can break that relationship, move one at a time. Or what's even better is cloning stereo with a disparity map attached, and it just pops into the right place. Although, because of the nature of roto, where you're often rotoing on edges that have parallax, so occlusion is happening there, and because of the nature of disparity maps, meaning they don't like occlusion, this is not always a magic bullet. But again, we tried every avenue. So this is what a disparity map looks like. So a disparity map is a dense optical flow track from one eye to the other. Basically, it's a map. It's a linear value in a whole pixels floating point of how to get from one image from the left eye to the right eye for every single pixel. We first started generating those on the CPU. It was really, really slow, as you can imagine, tracking every single pixel. And then we were able to implement a W cycles method on the GPU, and that was 200 times faster. So now people could do that interactively. And then we had to develop a system of using it, and that's forward mapping versus inverse mapping. And inverse mapping is what most tools have as their, I forget what it's called, a nuke, like an eye distort thing from Shake. Now, forward mapping is a lot more difficult because of the accumulation buffer. When you're shooting one pixel to a place you don't know where it's going to end up, you end up with problems if both of them are trying to go to the same place. It's inverse mapping is easy because it's like solving a maze from the inside out. Forward mapping is tougher because it's like doing a maze a normal way. And this is my favorite disparity map. Now, this is a false color disparity map, or even more false color than a normally one. What I did is create a lookup table so that hue shows you the direction of the pixel, and the luminance shows you the distance the pixel's going. This is not how they're normally stored, but it made viewing much easier. So every time a plate came online, we'd have this made, a QuickTime made of this, so that the compositor could quickly evaluate, get a feel for, one, the stereo of the shot, and then just see if the disparity map was going to work. I mean, clearly this one is not going to work near the edges of the frame, and that's typical. But what's cool is, you can see Pi, you can see him jump in the water, and then here in a second you see the convergence rack to the back, and you see all this stuff go into negative parallax. That's really cool. I always thought it'd be cool to create a cut of the movie that's just disparity maps. It'd be really trippy. We also experimented with other ways we could use disparity maps, and this is actually creating, meshing the depth. Once you know the fundamentals of the camera, and then you know the screen space disparity, that tells you everything about how far that pixel is away from the cameras, and then you just mesh those points. And you can see this is similarly noisy, and this didn't really go anywhere, but again, we explored every avenue, and this kind of stuff, even if it didn't end up being used on Life of Pi, drove our tools. We try to learn a lesson from every endeavor. All right, so this is the stereo camera rig. It's huge and complicated, and here's a better look at it. So what you've got is one camera on the top and one on the bottom, and then inside that matte box, there's a mirror. And one camera shoots through that mirror, one camera shoots off of that mirror, and then you get the stereo plates. Here's another view of it. You can see that the mirror inside the matte box there. And so it creates plates that look like this. Now, I'm sure the other speakers have given you an impression that good stereo does not look like this. It doesn't change colors, and it doesn't move in the Y component. So what do we do about this? We create a new department. We call it Stereo QC, and it turns these scans into usable stereo plates that we can feed through the rest of our pipeline. So the scans actually come in oriented any number of ways, because you saw the way the camera's oriented, shooting off a mirror and upside down. So they can come in flipped in any number of ways, and it's actually not always obvious. So we have somebody put eyes on it and just figure out, okay, this is clearly what makes sense. That's not something that we can easily automate, so we have somebody put eyes on it. But a lot of this stuff is easy to automate, but when it goes wrong, we need somebody to catch it. So we need somebody putting eyes on it anyways. So in the 1 hour it takes somebody to do the QC, to check the QC, if we automated it, they could do it. So we just had compositors do it. So they did the orientation, they did color, and then registration or alignment, making sure there were no, basically minimizing the Y disparity. Then they also removed lens distortion so they could pass it directly onto tracking, and they'd also kick out the disparity map. So when we set up this pipeline, this was unusual. We didn't know of anybody else doing QC before tracking like this at the head of the pipeline. But really, the only production that had taken place before was Avatar. And so we talked to them, and they did it at the end, all in the comp. And we wanted to do it up front because we wanted everybody to view like good, natural, comfortable stereo throughout the pipeline. And as a kind of animation primarily only house, we show the client a lot of animation on top of BGs, and if that was hurting them, that kind of hurt the process. So let's look at the plates again. So the alignment here, there are kind of 3 components to it. We had to do all planar transformations to do the alignment, and I'll explain why in a second, but you want to look at the center of the frame, the very center. That should never have any Y disparity, and we see there is some here. It's moving down a little bit. Then we want to look at the center of the right, center and Y, of the left and the right sides of frame, and if they're moving in opposing directions, that gives us a sense if there's rotation or not. And you can see there's a little bit of a counterclockwise rotation going on here. And then finally, you watch for a focal length change or a zoom. And there you look for the center of the top and bottom of the frame, and if they're moving in opposing directions, you've got to zoom. And so it's really hard to tell here, but there's a slight decrease in the focal length in the right eye. And once you spend a week doing this, you get really, really good at it. A QC like this would take maybe 10 minutes. And so the difference here after QC looks like that. So you can see it's slight zoom in, a slight clockwise rotation to counter that, and a slight pan up. and then afterwards. And so now they're aligned really well. And then that same process would kick out a disparity map. The disparity map for this shot looks like this. So keystoning. Keystoning is the reason we couldn't fix that plate in a more complex way. You know, we have the disparity map. Why couldn't we just equal out all the y disparity? So we tried that at first and then realized that screws up tracking. Life of Pi and Yogi Bear were both shot with towed-in cameras. And towed-in cameras are rotated towards each other. And that creates keystoning. Most of the time it's minor. It's just along the edges of frame, so it's not often something you need to correct for. You know, but we wanted to make the images perfect, so we explored why keystoning couldn't be fixed before tracking. So here's, you know, an image grid. And then here's what it looks like when you shoot it with stereo cameras. So you can see you've got the normal horizontal parallax here. But then up here we've got vertical parallax, and that's bad. That makes your eyes do this, and that's painful. Here's a little inset to show you that vertical disparity. So that's because cameras, when they're towed in, shoot like this. One is kind of, because of its perspective, is necessarily closer to some of the image features. So they appear bigger in one eye, and that creates vertical parallax. So because fixing that creates a plate that no camera could have created, we can't solve for the camera. So we need to leave it in. And we do leave it in. And then it's evaluated on a case-by-case basis, whether or not we want to fix that in the comp. So let's look at another example of some plates. You can see we've got the same problems with color and the same problems with alignment. But there's actually something else happening here too. Kind of pay attention to the patch of water directly under the life raft on the screen left. It's kind of stretching a little bit. We'll take a look at the QC'd plates. And this is about as good as you can get. This is perfect. My hat's off to Brandon Nelson, who is Life of Pi's stereo supervisor, its compositing supervisor, and actually later a sequence supervisor. He really kind of elevated our standards for QC. And so here's a map of the Y disparity. It's the absolute value of it. And then in the center there is where the Y disparity is 0. So normally on a flat wall like that, you'd expect a flat line. This curvy line means the mirror was bent. So we saw this on some plates that they sent us from on set, and we were able to flag it as a problem, and they fixed it, and it was only a problem in a handful of plates after that. So we fixed it with a disparity map, doing some warping. We had to tell tracking that we were doing that, because again, it created a plate that no camera could have created, so they couldn't solve for it. But they special cased it, and it was okay. So how do we fix the color? The easiest way is with a histogram matching tool. A histogram match just looks at the histogram in the image, kind of chops it up into bins, and then comes up with a 2D LUT to make the colors look the same. Sometimes it doesn't work so well, like on this shot from Yogi. Water typically presents a really big problem. So this is even after a histomatch. You can see it's matched the sky well and maybe the skier well, but the water in the mountains are a mess. On LOP, or on Life of Pi, we used a quarter wave plate in front of the cameras, and that retarded most of the polarization. We didn't have a problem nearly as bad. But just in case we did, we came up with this block-based matching. And that chops up both images into a series of blocks, do the same histomatch, and it came out pretty well. Any remaining differences, we'd use a localized color matching, which uses a disparity map to stack the plates, kind of extract the color differences, and then reapply them. All right, so this is kind of a quick tour of our studio pipeline. The ingestion delivery has to deal with twice as much data, but that's basically it. Our color correction tool at the time, Baselight, didn't support stereo, so we had to come up with a solution for that, basically split off one eye and then reapply the color corrections back to both. And then we also had to deal with the RE Alexa color space. It shoots in this format called log-C, which has amazing range, linear values up to 57. But it was kind of a pain, and we had to have engineers from RE actually come to Rhythm and Hues so we could talk out how to linearize this stuff. Stereo QC we covered, and then tracking. So we've got to track twice as many plates, try to make it not twice as much work, but we needed much tighter tracks than before. So we're able to use witness cameras, and fortunately most plates on Life of Pi had witness cameras like this, and that took a lot of the guesswork out of the tracking. We needed to get that rocking boat perfectly tracked, and this was a great help in doing that. After that, the track would move on to camera layout. camera layout would adjust things like convergence, and if it was an all CG shot, they would be adjusting interocular too. We had one shot that it was actually the last shot in the movie, was a real pain to do because the stereo actually collapses throughout the length of the shot while the shot transitions to black and white. So it was kind of like Ang Lee's way of closing the movie. We lose the stereo effect, and then it fades to black and white. So getting that animated and interocular and convergence just right was a really important task for camera layout. This next breakdown I'm going to show you is not technically a stereo thing, but it was a really cool innovation for Life of Pi. So what's going on here is the tank had a limit on the height and period of the swells it could produce, and Ang wanted more drama and more chaos. So what we did was take that tracked camera and that match move boat, and we parented that camera to the boat, and then we could rock the two together so the camera was dependent on the boat. And that kept the boat in the same screen space because we can't really mess with that because it screws up the stereo effect, and we need to track it and put a tiger in it. But what it did was move the horizon in really dramatic ways. So when you watch this, pay attention to the difference in the horizon from the plate to the comp. You see it's pretty dramatic. Having that horizon pitch around like that really gave the shot a dramatic open ocean stormy feel. And I'm going to play it once again and check out the cameras in the corners here. You can see the track camera is pretty tame, and then the camera takeover, which again is locked to the boat. So the boat's not changing at all in screen space, but we get to change everything around the boat in any way we want. And this way we had the boat ride huge waves and had the horizon pitch up and down, hopefully not making people seasick, but really giving you a sense that this is a crazy stormy sea. BG Prep, unfortunately, was nearly twice the work. They had the same tools for roto as I just showed you, similar tools for paint where they could look at both images side by side and kind of work interactively with both of them, applying the same paint strokes with a stereo offset. And then, of course, try to use disparity maps as much as possible. Anim and Tech Anim are mostly unaffected because they're working with a single asset. Until it gets rendered by stereo cameras, it's pretty much the same workflow for them, except that they had to be more careful with where they place things. Ground interaction, which is always a big thing with animation when they're working with plates, became really important because if the tiger's pod just comes that close to hitting the ground but doesn't, you're going to see that in stereo, where in 2D they could probably get away with it. It's just going to affect the shadows. They also couldn't cheat the scale, which is actually something they do quite a bit. The directors know they have control over any aspect they want, so if they want the tiger to appear bigger and more menacing, he could have asked us to cheat it forward just a little bit, and in 2D, again, if it appears to track well, it's not a problem, but in stereo, you can't do that cheat at all. Lighting and effects were similarly unaffected. It was primarily a bookkeeping thing. They need to make sure they're using the right stereo asset for the camera. But then they also could figure out when they needed to render mono or stereo, meaning to speed up the workflow, they just render one eye for a while until we wanted to go to final, and they'd render both eyes and actually take that hit in stereo. But what they could do until then was fake the stereo for the right eye. Because similarly, like having a projection or having a disparity map you can project from the left to the right eye, we can make a disparity map for the tiger, say. Because we have it Z-depth, we have the cameras, and that's all we need to know. So we can do this at render time in an extra couple seconds. We get the right eye for basically for free. It doesn't look as good, but we can work 90% of the pipeline like that. All right, compositing. So there were some new constraints, but also some new opportunities. Simple transformations. We couldn't move the image very much at all because that would break the stereo effect. We couldn't use practical elements. Our library of practical elements was all mono. No edge band-aids, but they don't look good in stereo, so we couldn't pull crappy keys and edge blend or edge blur or whatever. We turned all those edge buzzwords into bad words. We just didn't use them on Life of Pi with a few exceptions. And then we had to match the stereo some elements, and I'll take you through all that. But there were also some new opportunities. Disparity dissolves, breaking the frame, and some lens effects. And then finally there's dimensionalization, so let me take you through that. So simple transformations. Rotating it will break the stereo. So you can't just take this element and rotate it to compose the shot differently like we needed to here. Small zooms are usually okay, but they're still going to break the stereo effect a little bit on the edges, or they're going to change the apparent depth. Panning is fine because they'll keep both images in the same relationship to each other. I'll cover a fix for this in a second. So practical elements are mostly off limits unless they're intentionally planar or unless they're really far from camera where you wouldn't expect to see much stereo. We could try procedural dimensionalization, but that doesn't typically work out very well, especially with a show with such high standards like this one. So it means no using water elements like this, which would have been great for Life of Pi. No snow or dust. And most unfortunately, no slow-mo explosions. You can all imagine how much better Life of Pi would have been with a slow-mo explosion in every single scene. So keying, I mentioned, was a problem, and we didn't want to use edge band-aids because they don't look good in stereo. So we really tried to raise the standards of our keying. So we came up with something called spill retargeting. It was called blue replace unlock because I'm really bad at naming things, but this is a much sexier name, much more purpose for FMX. So it got us perfect keys. I mean, perfect in quotes, but the best keys we've ever done. No hair was lost, no edge was crunched. The operation was very simple. You just define the spill, so you can extract it, pick a new light source, and there's no matte generated. So here we use a very powerful spill suppression tool to define what that new light source should be, and the difference of that gives us just the extracted spill. Now with that, we can compare that to the background and see in which ways every single pixel of the spill needs to move to turn it into the background, and we can multiply it back on top of the image. I'm glossing over that, but it was a pretty simple network that we built, and it actually got used on way more shots than I expected it to. It does have some serious constraints in that it's kind of monolithic, you can't break it open, and there is no matte generated, so you can't treat the element as its own separate entity. So here's some examples.
Come on!
So this is the motion blur being keyed more or less perfectly. And again, this is a clean blue screen, but anybody who's tried to do this kind of keying knows that this is, for some reason, a pain in the ass still. If you tried to extract this as an element, even with the best keyers like Keylight and Primat, you'd still lose some of that, and we couldn't on this show. Especially important on this because Claudia Miranda, the DP, decided to use a really wide shutter angle when he shot this movie, as much as 300, 320 degrees, a lot more like video, actually. But what that did was give us a lot more motion blur to deal with, and we had to keep that because his intention was the more motion blur, the less stroby the stereo projection's going to be, and that was conceived to be like a really big problem. So also important were these close-ups, where we didn't want to lose a single hair or single bit of motion blurred edge. So here you can see every single hair is being kept, and even the hairs you might expect to lose or get a little bit more transparent, they're actually getting darker against the sky, which is what you'd expect on a shot like this. Now, again, this is a really clean blue screen, and maybe people who aren't accustomed to keying don't see this as a very big problem, right? You just say, key it, and it's done. But it's not that simple, and it drove me crazy. Like, we can see exactly what needs to be kept and what needs to be lost. And so that's what kind of drove this, is, you know, I knew we could get better keys, and fortunately we did. But not all the time. This obviously is a nightmare and just required a lot of roto. So that depth stereo reconciliation I was talking about, we had to match a CG water surface to a plate water surface in stereo. Now the water guys did a great job of matching the swells, which I talked about in my earlier talk, but they didn't line up exactly in stereo. You know, it kind of, if you can imagine two pieces of paper like this, they're mismatched like that or like that, you're going to see that in stereo, so we needed to kind of seam them together like that. And so we did that with a disparity map again. Here's a little breakdown showing how that split works. The straight out of the water on the left, and then the color-corrected water and plate on the right, and then plate again on the left, and then final comp. So you can see where that split was, and that's what we needed to kind of get to match in stereo. So we created a disparity map for the plate water by just using that optical flow tracking. The disparity map for the CG water was super simple because we had that very accurate Z-depth. And then it was simple arithmetic to find the difference and then apply half to one, half to the other to get them to stick together like that. And here's a much more dramatic example. of blending plate and CG. This it's actually used a matte generated by effects to keep that split line in the same place in 3D space, not screen space. And so most of it we were able to hide behind these foreground peaks, and it made the split very effective here and actually very easy. But obviously you can see the color correction was a huge problem. All right, so another cool thing we can play with is disparity dissolves. Now, when you see a normal dissolve in stereo, it's necessarily going to have stereo conflicts because you're seeing one semi-transparent over the other. And your eyes can sense there's depth here and depth here, but it doesn't, you never see that in the real world. So that was a problem. Ang Lee wanted to use a ton of dissolves in this movie, so we played with ways to use the disparity map to kind of mitigate some of those problems. And so this is the best way I could think to demonstrate it. It was a really subtle effect, and then I can't show this part in 3D, so I'm going to show it in anaglyph. So when I play it, pay attention to the red and the blue colors as that fade happens. So see the tarp at the top, you watch those two colors disappear because what we're doing is changing that convergence of that area locally to match Pi's head. And then similarly on Pi's shoulder, it comes in at the depth of water, but then as the dissolve happens, comes back out towards us. So this kind of morphs one to the other. It creates this kind of stretchy mesh that it looks a little weird in stereo, but it solves the depth conflicts, which was actually more important. And then another thing we could do was what I call dip to flat, which is where you use a disparity map to collapse the depth of both. And so you're just doing the dissolve with a mono image. And then you come back out to stereo. And that sounds, again, like it would feel really weird to watch, but it was really natural. All right, breaking the frame. We had a lot of fun with this. What Ang actually did on throughout the movie, which you didn't see in the clips I showed you because they weren't from the DVD, but he changed the aspect ratio throughout the show, throughout the film. So on this flying fish sequence, he actually squeezed it down, animated these letterbox bars in from the normal 16:9 to 2:35, and he felt like each sequence was its own little vignette and needed to have its own feel, and so that's one of the ways he wanted to do that. So you can see everything kind of in front of the screen plane in our space is coming out at us, is breaking that letterbox bar. It lends even more to the frame, the film frame, this projector screen being a window into another world, and you can see stuff kind of come in and out. It wasn't so much a storytelling choice as a stylistic one, but I thought it was really cool and really engaging. So here's one of the places it was used. So you can see the fish coming from the outside of frame and kind of past you. And then in this particularly beautiful all CG shot, so we had a lot of fun with that because they allowed the compositors to pick which fish for where and break out the ones they thought were the coolest. Stereo lens flares. There were a lot of stereo lens flares on Life of Pi. It wasn't like J.J. Abrams level, but there were a lot because there are a lot of strong light sources. And on this shot, which you saw in stereo, the water mirrored the sky, and so it had Pi kind of sitting out there alone. Since it mirrored the sky, the water appeared at the same depth as the sky, so it was all the way back there. So what the lens flare actually did here was serve to kind of connect Pi's space to the sky and really fill it out. And so you also got the kind of star flare from the sun coming out in depth as well. So you can kind of see that here in Wiggle Vision. This is what the flare looks like on its own. This is the output of a procedural lens flare tool that we had, but was rebuilt again by Brandon Nelson for stereo. And each element is built and controlled separately: color, space, or its location, scale, softness. And then he seeded it with values that matched Life of Pi's camera. And then this is an animated wedge showing actually not animating its location, but animating its interocular. We did that by animating its left and right eye principal point. The principal point is usually where the lens flare comes through the nodal point of the lens, and it's the same on every lens. So breaking it like this wasn't real world at all, but stereo flares aren't real world. They're never captured by stereo camera rigs because you saw what stereo camera rigs look like. You know, maybe it would be if it was captured by a side-by-side perfectly aligned camera rig, but those don't exist, and you don't really shoot side-by-side because you can't get the cameras that close. So this was a lot of fun too, because again, we were given a lot of freedom to kind of place them in the scenes we wanted to, and put them at the depth we wanted to. Lens drops were another bit of fun we had. So I'm going to play this. And so this has a number of lens drops, but they're not immediately obvious. If I show you wiggle vision, you can see them a lot easier. And that's kind of the point. It was a subtle way to engage viewers in the action. So we don't usually like to use gimmicks like this, but putting them in a way like this that's not compositionally distracting or offensive, but that the viewer still gets a sense of when they're watching the scene, maybe even kind of subliminally, is really cool. And we'd create it with something like this. This is since lens drops are kind of little lenses themselves, we used a UV map that looks up the entire frame for each little sphere. And here's a kind of pre-generated one that compositors could use that has them projected down through like an advection field, but they could generate their own. Again, this isn't new. This has been done before, but the new kind of hard part was stereo, and actually getting this packaged up into a tool that was consistent for people to use. There was actually 60 people in four different countries that needed to use this and get a consistent look across the show. And finally, dimensionalization, which is a fancy word, awkward word for creating stereo from mono. But why are we doing it in a native stereo production where we have stereo? That would be because of distracting artifacts, like these polarization artifacts, or we'd use the plate's own disparity to equalize them, or bad or impractical stereo capture. So this is a plate from Yogi where, again, the Y disparity is nearly as much as the X here, and it was really painful. So we used a more complex dimensionalization technique where we broke apart the foreground and the background, did a procedural in-paint on the background to fill the hole, and then we could move the background, and we'd figure out where to move the background to by actually modeling it with geometry, setting up a pair of idealized cameras, and then figuring out the difference between those and the bad cameras. And we ended up with much better looking stereo. The point is, we never guessed. We never just rotoed something and moved it to the left or the right. You know, we tried to base this always on geometry. So if you let me use the same slide again, this problem was actually pretty complex. This needed to be an animated rotation on the boat. It needed to animate throughout the shot and pitch and rock and roll. And the static offset was not going to work for that. So what we did was do the offset, or do the transformation, and then match move that. Once we got it match moved, we could render the object z-depth using the cameras, turn that into screen space disparity, and then project it to a new view. And hopefully the shot looks familiar. So, in conclusion, what I hope you got from this talk is that stereo is a tool for storytelling. It's not just a gimmick, and it can be motivated by art, not just profit. And for visual effects artists, it's hard and it's technical, but it can be fun, and it can afford us new avenues for creativity as well. Thank you, and I'll take any questions you have. Questions? I covered it all. Either I was really thorough or really boring.
Morning also. You have a stereo QC department which came before the match move. Did you have any kinds of problems during the stereo QC process that did not, have match moves come out properly, or?
We did initially, definitely. During our R&D period, we came across a ton of problems, but identifying them early in that period meant we ran into basically none that were kind of production halting. All of them we had dealt with before in our R&D. So some of them were having to fix the plates with a disparity map, in non-planar ways. And then other problems where we had tracking and QC talk a lot back and forth were areas like where QC couldn't solve it without doing something really serious to the plate. So they'd get tracking to track the bad plates, and then QC could generate these new idealized cameras, get the plate to match as closely as they could to those, and then those would be the new cameras. So there was a little bit of a circular workflow there, but again, it was necessary to create like perfect stereo. Way in the back. That works.
If you made tests with tracking markers or something floating in the water, because I'm not from the visual effects point of view, but I'm a stereographer, and I would think that it is really hard to get disparity maps out of water. So I would have thought putting their little dots or something in there, would that have helped? Did you do tests?
Yes, definitely. I covered a lot of that in the first talk, and I tried to keep as little overlap as possible. No problem. It was, we tried a lot of stuff. What we ended up doing most to track the water, and this is mostly to get the swell height and period, was when we tracked the boat, we could use that grossed Y offset, and that would tell us most of what we needed to know. You know, it would kind of draw a curve in time to create a wave that looked just like the one in the plate. But we also tried tracking the heat in the water using infrared cameras. And that obviously, or as you can imagine, maybe it was really, really noisy and didn't go anywhere, but it, we really wanted to try everything. And then we also tried putting a net filled with floating balls onto the water to track that. And that, it worked out okay, we could track it, but it was only marginally more useful than tracking the objects we already had on the surface of the water, like the Pi's raft that he built and the lifeboat. And so we didn't really take that any further either. As far as creating disparity maps in the water, I thought that would be really problematic too, but partly due to that quarter wave plate on the camera, which kind of rejects a lot of polarized light, the water looked pretty similar, and with the little bits of noise in it from wind and from waves and from droplets and stuff, that gave the disparity tracker enough to grab onto, and we got great disparity maps for the water.
Questions? Let's thank the speaker.
I'll see you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.